lovely people, and welcome back to my podcast, Ring a Bell. I'm Astrid Bell, and I really hope everyone's day is going well. Today, I'd like to discuss the 2021 film Dune. If you haven't seen it yet, I highly, highly recommend it. As someone who's read Frank Herbert's series maybe 5 times over, I think the film's a pretty incredible adaptation of a pretty special and a little bit difficult set of subject material. So on to the matter at hand. Today I'm interested in sort of dissecting the white savior trope in the 2021 Dune film, because from what I've seen, one of its most prevalent criticisms has been that it perpetuates the white savior stereotype. For those of us that are familiar with Herbert's books, it's pretty clear to us that our protagonist, Paul, serves as a mockery of the white savior trope, and I'll include a quote from Frank Herbert to illustrate this point. I wrote the Dune series because I had this idea that charismatic leaders ought to come with a warning label on their forehead, may be dangerous to your health. So clearly, for those of us that have read the books and are familiar with Herbert, Paul was never intended to endorse the white savior stereotype. But I do agree with some of the primary criticisms of this one, which is that it needs to be a piece of art that can stand on its own. Viewers shouldn't need to do a bunch of external research or be entirely familiar with the Dune universe coming in to understand and consume this film. I will concede here that this film can definitely be better understood by those of us who do have an understanding of the Dune universe, just because it's intrinsically extremely complex, and so is the storyline. I still think it should be accessible to all people. Even further, when this 2021 film was released, we weren't yet certain whether or not the next two proposed films would follow it. So this film needs to act as a standalone in that it shouldn't rely on future films to clarify or correct it. So for this reason, I'm interested in highlighting several aspects of the 2021 Dune film that I think pretty clearly convey its intent to refute rather than support the white savior trope. I'd love it if you stuck around. I do want to highlight here a research paper called The White Savior Film and Reviewers' Reception, which essentially says that many people who review movies currently are more concerned with the social rewards that come with identifying and condemning racism and tropes than examining kind of the complexity and cultural relevance of modern media. So I think identifying tropes has kind of become more of a moral battleground than anything else. So I would really appreciate if all of you as viewers would come into this argument with just an open mind. I'm essentially looking to illustrate a distinction between Dune containing the white savior trope and endorsing it, which definitely takes some critical examination of the subject material rather than a surface level reading. I do want to take a step back and acknowledge, though, that I'm speaking clearly from a place of extreme privilege, as someone who has not ever been on the receiving end of the harm that perpetuation of stereotypes such as the white savior narrative causes. But into kind of the meat and potatoes of my argument. I'd like to start briefly by talking about how Paul's identity interacts with the white savior trope, because I think it's really important to talk about how Paul really does seem to fit the traditional conventions both of giftedness and more generally of the white savior trope. I'd like to highlight Leslie Margolin's book here. It's titled Goodness Personified, The Emergence of Gifted Children. And in it, essentially, Margolin identifies traditional views of giftedness as correlated with sort of two things: a high social class, and he identifies giftedness as hereditarily caused by race. So pretty clearly here, Paul's status as a white duke's son molds really well onto this view. And in addition to that, we as viewers receive the insight near the beginning of the film that the Bene Gesserit have been carefully crossing bloodlines to bring forth a mind powerful enough to bridge space and time. And the result of that is Paul. So we see very explicitly that Paul is the result of intentional genetic manipulation, which very much supports the view Margolin identified that giftedness is hereditary and intrinsic. So I think surface level, Paul definitely reinforces those views. I think it's also important to highlight one of the main counter-arguments that I saw. I'll highlight Tasnia Maula's article, Dune proves that the white savior trope is alive and well here, because she points out that relegating characters of color to the sidelines of a story in favor of centering white perspectives is kind of one of the center points of a white savior trope, which is something that on the surface level seems like something Dune is very guilty of. So surface level, Paul's identity and the way that he's handled throughout the film seems to perpetuate white savior narratives, right? So I think it might be more relevant and interesting to move on and address the ways that Paul influences and interacts with the story. So from the very beginning of the film, the way that Paul is presented to us as viewers is really important. So the very first time we actually see Paul, it's following a speech by Chani, she's a character that's one of the Fremen, who are the native people of Arrakis, in which she asks, who will our next oppressors be? And the next cut is immediately to Paul sleeping. So I think this really intentionally framed immediate cut is definitely a reference to his potential future with the Fremen, rather than showing his father, the Duke, who is the one who will actually be taking control of Arrakis. We're introduced to Paul, which definitely indicates that we'll see pretty important narratives of oppression from him in the future. In addition, I think throughout the film, we're encouraged to be very skeptical of Paul's Messiah status, which is kind of also a staple of the white savior trope, because we get big and important glimpses into the manipulations that took place in order to frame Paul as a Messiah. So near the beginning of the film, the Reverend Mother tells Paul's mother, on Arrakis, we've done all we can for you. A path has been laid. Let's hope he doesn't squander it. And this view is echoed by Paul later when he arrives on Arrakis, because he claims the religious passion of the people of Arrakis is unfounded. In his own words, they see what they've been told to see. So as viewers, we're already extremely skeptical of things that are taken for granted in typical white savior narratives. Now that we've kind of explored Paul's identity and the way he's presented to us, I think I'd like to move on to what I see as the most significant aspect of the film that leads us to sort of reject the white savior narrative and the argument that Dune is enforcing it. Essentially, I think Paul's visions of the future are the most indicative thing of the direction that these films plan to take the story in. More specifically, his future visions of the Holy War. Paul himself describes a warrior religion that waves the Atreides banner in my father's name, and fanatical legions worshipping at the shrine of my father's skull, a war in my name. These glimpses of Paul's future completely reject the white savior narrative because we're exposed to the goal of the Fremen through a character called Liet Kynes. Essentially, the goal of the Fremen is to terraform Arrakis and rid themselves of their oppressors, whose presence has always been contingent on the harvesting of spice. So essentially, the Fremen are looking to terraform Arrakis so that it's much easier to live. Water is not a scarce resource, but the availability of spice is contingent on the environment of the Arrakis staying the way that it is. So the Fremen have always been interested in ridding themselves of the oppression that accompanies the spice. So not only is terraforming Arrakis important to them in terms of their ability to live well, but it's also important in terms of their freedom. And instead of seeing liberation from the Fremen as a result of Paul's actions in Paul's visions of the future, we see bloody war scenes, and many of them take place off planet. So we're seeing Fremen being stripped from their home planet and deployed to other planets across the galaxy for the purpose of a war that Paul has created. I think this pretty clearly refutes everything we would expect of a white savior narrative, because white saviors are meant to lift the communities they're planted in out of suffering, and we see the Fremen being used as warriors and pawns in Paul's meaningless genocidal slaughter for his own ends. So kind of tying everything together, I think with all these clues that we get in the first film, I predict that the second film will sort of center on Paul's integration into the Fremen culture and subsequent abuse of the power that he accumulates through this integration. I'm anticipating that we'll kind of follow the book storyline as Paul sort of uses both his Bene Gesserit skills and his Messiah status to manipulate the Fremen into fighting a brutal, bloody war for his own purposes. I do anticipate that the second film will really and truly destruct the white savior narrative by illustrating in a huge and impactful way just how dangerous charismatic leaders like Paul can be. That's all I have for you today. Definitely food for thought. Please don't hesitate to leave any questions, comments, concerns, your own opinions in the comments below. Thank you all for listening if you've made it this far, and I will see you next time. Bye!